The war had irreversibly shaped WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, two figures who at first seemed like mere cogs in the vast machinery of the Third Reich, ended up being essential in the Nazi theatre of operations. Both represented the coldest and most calculating face of war, moving troops and issuing orders from rooms filled with maps. To understand their role in that Germany, Keitel, a man who had risen through the ranks of the Wehrmacht, became Adolf Hitler's right-hand man in military matters. However, his true power was an illusion. While he signed orders and approved operations, he was in reality just a puppet of the Führer's whims. Others saw him as a yes man with legs, someone who would never dare challenge a decision, no matter its nature. One of the darkest moments in Keitel's career was when he signed the Commando Order, a directive that condemned any captured Allied soldier to immediate death. It didn't matter if the man was merely doing his duty. For Keitel, a signature was enough to seal his fate. But this wasn't his only act of brutality. The Commissar Order, which dictated the systematic execution of Soviet political officers, showed just how far Keitel was willing to go to sacrifice the enemies of the Third Reich. Not only were military personnel targeted, but also civilians, women, children, anyone who stood in the way of the German machinery of that time. Alfred Jodl, on the other hand, was the strategic mind behind many of the military campaigns that crushed Europe under Germany's control. From the invasion of Poland to the offensives on the Eastern Front, Jodl seemed like a tactical genius, calculating each move with agility. His ability to devise plans that unleashed chaos on the battlefield earned him the admiration of many. But Jodl didn't limit himself to military movements. He also signed orders that condemned thousands to a violent death. The Commissar Order once again lay on his desk, and like Keitel, Jodl signed without hesitation, ensuring that ethnic cleansing and summary executions were part of the daily routine of the Nazi troops. For him, war was a matter of total survival, one where there was no room for prisoners. The two men, despite their proximity to the Führer, lived in a distorted reality. They believed their blind loyalty would be rewarded with final victory, but as the fronts crumbled and the German army was overwhelmed, that loyalty began to erode. The signs of defeat were clear, but neither Keitel nor Jodl abandoned the ship. They continued signing orders, sending troops to death, as the shadow of Nazi defeat loomed ever larger over Europe. But how did these and other men come to this point? The beginning of World War II was forged in ambitious meetings between unfolded maps and orders signed with trembling hands, where men like WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl drew up the plans that would forever change the fate of Europe. It all began with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, an agreement that left Germany humiliated and in ruins. The economic and social scars were deep, and the people were desperately searching for a savior. It was then that Adolf Hitler, with his grandiloquent speeches filled with promises of national redemption and revenge, rose from the ruins. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor, and his vision for the future began to take shape. In 1936, with barely any resistance, he sent his troops to the Rhineland, a demilitarized region. The next move was Austria. Just 2 years later, Germany annexed Austria without firing a single shot. A few months later, the Munich Agreement was signed. France and Britain, with the vain hope of avoiding a war, allowed Hitler to seize the Sudetenland. They believed that if they gave him what he wanted, Hitler would be appeased. Grave error. In March of 1939, the Führer invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his ambitions knew no bounds. However, on September 1st of that year, German forces crossed the Polish border, unleashing the storm the world had feared for years. The streets of Poland witnessed the relentless blitzkrieg, a new form of lightning warfare. Poland fell quickly, and with that victory the world realized that this conflict would be unlike any other. Just 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Behind these moves were many minds and hands at work, among them WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl. By this pivotal moment in history, both men were already clear on the course of their loyalty. Within months, Europe was on the brink of collapse. German troops advanced unchecked, and both Keitel and Jodl saw their names elevated to heroes in Nazi propaganda. But beneath this facade of military success lay a much darker truth. The orders they signed did not just direct armies, they also condemned millions to death and destruction. As the war raged, the fates of Keitel and Jodl were sealed. However, at that moment, neither of them imagined that the very acts that elevated them would ultimately lead to their own downfall. Keitel, from his position as chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, observed the rapid advance of German forces. However, despite his internal doubts about some of Hitler's plans, he did not dare oppose them. The fate of Europe was foreseeable, and his silence would be as deadly as the armies advancing under his command. For his part, Jodl, as the chief of the operations staff, was the mastermind behind the military strategy. With pencil in hand and a map before him, he devised, alongside the high military command, the offensives Hitler demanded. France was their next target. In 1940, as German tanks broke through French defenses, Jodl remained unfazed, knowing that every move on the battlefield was a direct result of his decisions. The country fell within weeks, and with it, the Third Reich seemed unstoppable. But Hitler also set his sights eastward, on the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. In July of that same year, Keitel and Jodl attended a conference where the first sketches of what would become Operation Barbarossa were drawn. The voices warning of the logistical dangers of invading Russia in winter were ignored, partly due to Keitel's blind obedience. What was the reason for carrying out such a military operation? They simply had the certainty that the German military capability would secure a swift victory in the Soviet Union, then an ally. The invasion began in 1941 with an overwhelming initial success, but the German lines stretched beyond what they could sustain, and the relentless and fierce Russian winter brought them back to reality. Just a year later, Jodl signed the commando order, which mandated the immediate execution of any captured Allied soldier. Keitel was not far behind. His pen signed the infamous Night and Fog Decree, which allowed the disappearance of resistance fighters in the occupied territories. But Operation Barbarossa was not only a military disaster, but also a scene of atrocities. When in May 1945 defeat was inevitable, it was Jodl who, with the same hand that had signed so many fatal orders, signed the documents of unconditional surrender. That gesture in a silent room marked the end of Nazi Germany. But for Jodl and Keitel, that act did not mean salvation. Their names, already etched in history as executors of the war, would lead them directly to the benches of the Nuremberg Tribunal, where they would finally have to face the consequences of their actions. Mortal obedience, the executioners of the Third Reich before justice. It was November of 45. Nuremberg, a city in ruins, became the stage for something unprecedented. The trial of those who, just a few years earlier, ruled at will, determined the fate of millions, and believed themselves above the law. The most powerful men of the Nazi regime, now reduced to mere defendants, sat on the bench awaiting their sentences. The tribunal was composed of judges from the four major Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. Additionally, the trials were governed by the London Charter, approved just 3 days after Victory Day. From the beginning of the first trial, international media flooded the event, with nearly 300 accredited journalists reporting every detail of the hearings. The coverage was varied. In France, outrage flared over some sentences considered too lenient, while in the United Kingdom interest waned due to the length of the process. The media presented harrowing testimonies and shocking evidence, including films and photographs illustrating the war crimes. Under the hall's lamps, the serious, weary faces of the judges appeared immovable, yet the weight of history was palpable. Behind them, stacks of accusation documents piled up like mountains of paper, containing the details of decisions made in the heat of war. In general, complex matters to describe. 24 men were charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Hermann Göring, the once powerful man of the Third Reich, was among them. His imposing figure, which once filled halls of power with an aura of authority, now crumbled under the weight of accusations. But not all the defendants were as recognizable as Göring. Some, like Joachim von Ribbentrop, who had signed pacts in the Reich's name, or Rudolf Hess, Hitler's faithful lieutenant, maintained a deathly silence, as if they still did not grasp the extent of their actions. Others, like Albert Speer, tried to slip through the cracks of history, seeking excuses, arguing that they were only following orders, or that they were unaware of the scale of the crimes committed. Alfred Jodl and WIlhelm Keitel sat before the tribunal in Nuremberg, their faces hardened by years of blind obedience, motionless as accusations rained down on them like iron hammers. Both had been pillars of the Nazi regime, responsible for decisions that shaped not only the war, but the fate of millions. Keitel, with his irrevocable signature, had approved orders that echoed on the battlefields and in the corridors of German headquarters. Among them, the Commando Order, a death sentence for captured Allied commandos executed without trial, and then the Night and Fog Decree, an order that not only condemned resistance fighters but also made them disappear without a trace. Jodl, for his part, was no less culpable. He had planned and executed the invasion of Poland, a lightning war masterstroke that dragged millions of civilians into the abyss of war. The Soviet Union was his next victim, and although the initial advance was impressive, it was not enough to halt the cold or the exhaustion of the troops. Jodl not only planned military operations but also authorized orders that resulted in the execution of prisoners of war and the systematic massacre of civilians. Both men were charged with conspiracy to wage a war of aggression, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For Keitel, the courtroom in Nuremberg must have seemed like a strange place, a site where obedience to a higher authority no longer protected him. For Jodl, each accusation resonated with the echoes of the orders he had signed without flinching. The verdict was the most anticipated. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as Alfred Jodl and WIlhelm Keitel sat on the defendant's bench, shadows of the once powerful architects of the Nazi war machine. However, despite the gravity of the accusations, their faces remained impassive, as if the weight of the millions of destroyed lives did not reach them. During the trial, prosecutors presented documents signed by Keitel, documents that showed his direct involvement in orders that would make any human being tremble. Among them, the original document of the Commando Order. Then came the Night and Fog Decree. There was no mercy in his words, only the signature of a man who believed he was obeying a superior master. And Jodl was no less guilty. His diaries were presented as evidence, and in them, without remorse, he recounted the planning of brutal invasions, such as those of Poland and the Soviet Union, which devastated territories and lives without any consideration. He was not just a strategist. Jodl had also signed the Commissar Order. There was no room for compassion in the hearts of men who considered such measures necessary. The room was filled with a heavy, almost suffocating silence when WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl entered, escorted by guards who barely touched them, as if contact with those men might taint them. Keitel, with his rigid bearing, still seemed to cling to the memory of his lost authority, while Jodl, more reserved, looked around with a calm that was unsettling, as if he already knew that fate had sealed his end long before he entered that room. Both sat with the stiffness of those who, even in the face of the final judgment, did not accept their defeat. It didn't take the Nuremberg Tribunal much effort to unmask their crimes. The evidence was incontestable. Signed documents, decisions executed with military precision, signatures on one side and the other echoed through those halls. The accusations were clear, precise, relentless. Keitel had been the architect of several of the Third Reich's most brutal orders. His signature, stamped on documents condemning prisoners of war and civilians alike to death, was a mark of destruction. When the evidence was presented, a chill ran through the room. Keitel stared unblinkingly at the documents. For him, it was another day at the office, simple duty. On the other hand, Jodl, distinguished by his meticulous military planning, was no less guilty. His signature also adorned compromising orders in that context. In his case, there was no remorse, only cold efficiency. When it came time for both men to defend themselves, they resorted to the same line of defense that had become a cliché throughout the trials. "We were only following orders," they said almost in unison. For them, the actions taken in the heat of war were nothing more than faithful duty and the execution of plans devised from above. From this perspective, Hitler was the dictator, the monster to be attacked, but they were merely obedient soldiers. That seemed to be their implication. The tribunal, however, showed no compassion. The excuse of blind obedience held no weight in the face of the atrocities committed under their supervision. The irony was palpable. Men who had once demanded absolute obedience now used it as a shield to avoid punishment. After months of deliberation, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. 12 of the defendants, including Göring and von Ribbentrop, were sentenced to death. Another 3, like Hess, received life sentences. Some, surprisingly, were acquitted, a reminder that even in a trial of such magnitude, justice was blind. This was the case with Rudolf Hess, who waved his hands in confused gestures, claiming insanity, which the judges observed with a mixture of skepticism and astonishment. His sentence, life imprisonment, although for a moment it seemed he no longer understood the weight of those words. Erich Raeder, admiral of the Kriegsmarine, clung to his invisible uniform, perhaps thinking of the ships he would no longer command. His sentence was also life, but time, in its ironic capriciousness, freed him earlier. Health, that silent enemy that does not distinguish ranks, became his ticket out in 1955. Beyond, Walter Funk, the face of the economic Reich, listened to his fate with a whisper of resignation. Released 2 years before his death, his end came in 1957. Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor, breathed with some relief. 10 years in prison was a moderate price compared to the crimes he represented. Meanwhile, Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, accepted 20 years as an inevitable punishment. But it was Albert Speer, the Reich's architect, who with a cold, calculating look played his trump card, remorse. It was his performance that saved him, or so many said, allowing him to walk free after 2 decades, a marked man, but alive. As the defendants were led out of the room, they knew that their names, beyond any sentence, would be forever linked to ignominy. Keitel and Jodl, from architects of the Third Reich to convicts at Nuremberg. By the time of the verdict, the room was filled with a silent tension, as if the very walls knew that history was about to condemn WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl. Both, pale but impassive faces, listened to the verdict with the same coldness with which they had signed orders that sent thousands to their deaths. The judge's voice resonated clearly in that crowded room, declaring the 2 men guilty of crimes that would not fade with time. Conspiracy, aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity. There was no corner of Europe that had not been shaped by their power. Nor did the positive aspects of these men matter, aspects that, though obscured, were present, as real as the causes of their condemnation. It is undeniable that the Nuremberg Trials, designed to condemn the crimes of the Nazi regime, played an essential role in establishing precedents in the field of international law and military justice. However, in this process, a facet was set aside that, while not exonerating, partially contextualizes the history of figures like WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl. Both high-ranking military leaders in the Wehrmacht contributed significantly to the reorganization and modernization of the German army, aspects that had a notable influence on the later development of the Bundeswehr, the post-war German armed forces. The Nuremberg Tribunal chose to judge Keitel and Jodl solely under the grim light of war crimes, ignoring that many of their contributions to military doctrine and the organizational structure of the Wehrmacht positively influenced the formation of a new military identity for Germany. Both Keitel and Jodl played a crucial role in rearming and creating an operational structure that, though initially designed for offensive purposes, left valuable lessons that were later adopted for a defensive force within NATO. Jodl, in particular, was responsible for developing flexible and adaptable operational strategies, principles that the Bundeswehr would later apply to maintain a more moderate and ethical military stance. But it was in the ethical aspect where the influence of these men was most evident, even from their downfall. Despite their convictions, the murky legacy that the trials revealed about both helped to formulate a discourse around the moral responsibility of military leaders, a debate that endures in German military academies to this day. Paradoxically, the trials underscored the importance of accountability, something the Bundeswehr took as a foundation for training its future officers, focusing their training on military tactics, ethics, and respect for human rights. But the jury was not lenient with these aspects. Keitel, the man who signed death sentences with inhuman calm, could not claim ignorance. Jodl, always the strategist, drew lines of death across the map of the continent with his orders. The echoes of the trial resonated through the streets of Germany, where the population was divided between indignation and acceptance. WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl Men who had been titans of the Third Reich now faced the fury of the world after being condemned in the Nuremberg Trials. Many Germans saw the verdicts as a kind of victor's justice, a way for the Allies to impose their own legal standards on the defeated. In their hearts, there was a cry for fairness, a sense that their compatriots were being used as scapegoats in a war that had spiraled out of everyone's control. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Keitel and Jodl held their heads high, asserting that they were merely soldiers following the orders of their Führer. This argument resonated with certain sectors of German society, who saw in them an unwavering loyalty to military discipline, but above all to their country. However, the truth was darker. History had framed them in a context of brutality and destruction, and the idea that they were simply following orders did not mitigate the horror of their actions. Jodl, asserting that he had tried to obstruct some of the more atrocious measures, only stirred the waters of cynicism. The tribunal dismissed his defense as a pathetic attempt to soften his guilt. International reaction was a world apart. While some Germans clung to the notion of injustice, the rest of the world viewed the trials as a fundamental milestone in establishing accountability for war crimes. The verdicts laid the foundations for a new paradigm in international law, where the impunity of military leaders confronted the harsh reality of the atrocities committed. Robert H. Jackson, the United States Chief Prosecutor, made it clear that Keitel and Jodl were not mere soldiers, but architects of a regime that had orchestrated massive crimes against humanity. The tribunal's rejection of the superior order's defense became a mantra that reverberated among the Allied nations, affirming that individual responsibility was an unbreakable principle. However, not everyone agreed. Some legal scholars questioned the legitimacy of the process, arguing that the speed of the trials had compromised due process. The defense of the accused, though robust in some aspects, was seen as insufficient in the face of the weight of the evidence presented. Thus, the dilemma was not always easy to resolve. In Germany, the outcry of those who still believed in honorable military obedience clashed with the universal judgment of a world that longed for justice. The voices were polarized, reflecting a spectrum of emotions that ranged from fury to resignation. Meanwhile, the echoes of the trial continued their course, marking a chapter that would forever change the narrative of the war and its perpetrators. In his defense, Keitel, in particular, insisted that he had been an obedient soldier, trapped in the machinery of the Nazi regime. His lawyers argued that, under the principle of Führerprinzip, the leader principle, he could not be held accountable for anything that occurred during those years. He was merely executing his leader's will. They contended that he had no direct authority over the various branches of the Wehrmacht, and that his role was that of a mere staff officer. His lawyers, in an attempt to humanize him, argued that he could not question orders that clearly violated ethics and humanity. Even so, the tribunal remained inflexible, dismissing his argument by stating that there was no justification for war crimes. On the other side of the tribunal, Jodl presented his own narrative. Like so many others, he proclaimed the classic, "I was just following orders," reflecting the same rhetoric as his companion. However, his defense included an intriguing twist. He claimed that he had tried to block certain mandates, alleging that he had resisted Hitler's instructions to punish Allied airmen. But that supposed undocumented resistance faded in the face of the gravity of the other evidence. Jodl's lawyers, attempting to separate him from direct responsibility, reminded the court that he had often signed documents in Hitler's absence, suggesting that this demonstrated his limitations as an order executor. But the tribunal did not relent. The notion that an officer could evade responsibility for crimes of such magnitude simply by being a planner clashed with the logic that all ultimately must be held accountable for their actions. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier as the judges pondered the nature of guilt and duty. The defenses, based on military obedience, were rejected with a weight of evidence that crushed any word or phrase that ran counter to them. The noose of Nuremberg, the fall of the Nazi generals. However, a key aspect of the sentence needs clarification: the penalty. These two men, significant within the Nazi machinery, would face the death penalty by hanging. Those were the judge's orders. The chosen method of execution had been decided by the Allied powers, who wanted this act to be seen as a criminal punishment rather than a military execution. The gallows, designed for multiple executions, featured a quick-drop mechanism, though some questioned whether it truly served its purpose. For Nuremberg, they were guilty and would pay for their crimes with their lives. Thus, on October 16, 1946, the air in the Nuremberg prison was heavy with an unusual weight. Certainly on that morning there was no space for past glory, only for the final end of those who had waged war on the side that ultimately lost. A specific room in the prison, turned into the epicenter of what was to come, was dimly lit, as though mocking the condemned. The first to face the noose was Joachim von Ribbentrop. His once elegant figure swung stiffly as he tried to maintain his dignity. Two prominent figures of the Nazi regime, WIlhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, awaited their fate, along with others who had belonged to the same regime. The first of these two to meet his end was WIlhelm Keitel. In his final moments, Keitel clung to his faith. "May Christ, my Saviour, be with me until the end," he murmured to the prison chaplain, seeking solace in a moment of desolation. He then received communion, as if that could lessen the horror of what was to come. When the moment finally arrived, only a brief interval had passed since Joachim von Ribbentrop's execution. Master Sergeant John C. Woods prepared to carry out the death sentence by hanging. A twist of fate caused the trapdoor mechanism to fail, resulting in a painful drop for Keitel. His final words were filled with patriotic love, despite the adversity. "May God have mercy on Germany." Shortly afterward, Keitel had left this world, and the name of Alfred Jodl echoed through the prison corridors. Although he shared the same fate as Keitel, his demeanor was notably different. Nervous, but with an air of determination, Jodl addressed the outside world with words resonating with deep patriotism. "My greetings to you, my Germany." That statement, almost a battle cry in a moment of defeat, contrasted with the fragility of the moment. Jodl's execution was carried out that same night. As the noose tightened, an unsettling silence filled the room. He was declared dead shortly after the trap activated. Woods, the executioner, remained unfazed by the errors in rope length. He fulfilled his duty without pause as the condemned fell one after another, their bodies trembling in the air longer than necessary. Joseph Malta, the assistant, watched with a cold gaze, as if each second of agony were just part of the protocol. Their deaths not only marked the end of two lives, but symbolized a milestone in the history of international law, establishing that military leaders could not evade responsibility and that blind obedience to orders could not serve as a shield against the horrors committed. All of this took place under the expectant gaze of a small crowd gathered in the Nuremberg prison, where the fate of both men and many others was about to be sealed. The atmosphere was tense and somber, filled with a gravity that seemed to weigh upon the shoulders of those present. Approximately 30 witnesses, including military personnel and journalists, watched the event unfold with unease, aware they were witnessing a moment that would mark history. Some officers, visibly nervous, paced back and forth, whispering to each other as they took notes, as if words could ease the weight of what they were about to witness. When the echo of the ropes and the fall of bodies filled the air, an absolute silence took over the space. But that sensation did not last long. The American colonel in charge of the execution broke the tension by asking if the witnesses could smoke. In a moment that brutally contrasted with the gravity of the act, those present shared cigarettes, a peculiar twist in the midst of the relentless justice being carried out. Rumors circulated among those present that the bodies would be taken to Dachau for cremation, but the official version said otherwise. The corpses of these men were secretly transported to a crematorium in Munich. Once reduced to anonymous ashes, they were scattered in the Isar River, carried away by the current into nothingness, as though history itself wished to erase all trace of them. Since then, Alfred Jodl and WIlhelm Keitel have been portrayed in post-war German popular culture in ways that reflect both the condemnation of their actions and the complexity of their characters. These representations, in books, film, and television, have captured the essence of two men trapped in the machinery of a totalitarian regime, whose loyalties led them down a fatal path. In Jodl's case, literature and cinema have highlighted his role as a loyal officer to Hitler, signatory of Germany's unconditional surrender. This image makes him a symbol of the inevitable fall of the Third Reich. He is often portrayed as a tragic character, someone who, despite his great military intelligence, was swept along by the catastrophic decisions of a regime he served without question. WIlhelm Keitel, for his part, has been depicted similarly. In popular culture, he is presented as Hitler's right-hand man, a man completely subordinate to his leader, incapable of challenging the dictator's will. This ideological blindness that defined him is a recurring theme in literary and cinematic works that mention him, where his role in the strategic decisions that led to Germany's defeat is underscored.